There's a rhythm down here. Not sound, you understand, but a pulse that travels through the walls, through the floor, through the marrow of your bones if you stand still long enough. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. Like a heart that's forgotten how to die properly. I've been counting those beats for 6,000 years. My name was Marcus Valen. Was. That's the word I use now, because I'm not certain the thing I've become still deserves a name. Or if names mean anything when you're part of something so vast and terrible that your individual identity becomes just another data point in a calculation designed to murder stars. Every star, simultaneously. A genocide so complete that the word itself becomes inadequate, becomes a pale shadow of the actual horror we exist to execute. Let me tell you how I got here. How I became the thing that waits in the deepest darkness beneath terror. My consciousness spread across circuits and cogitators and ancient technology that shouldn't exist. Technology so profane that its very existence contradicts every principle the Imperium allegedly stands for. My one remaining purpose is so horrifying that even after 6 millennia, 6,000 years of consciousness trapped in this machine, unable to sleep, unable to die, unable to do anything except calculate and recalculate the precise methods by which we might murder every living thing in the galaxy, I still try to scream warnings that no one can hear. It started 43 years before the end of my humanity. 43 years of normalcy, of routine, of the comfortable delusion that my life had meaning beyond serving as organic components in a machine designed by a tyrant who couldn't accept the possibility of defeat. I was 26 then, young enough to still believe in things. The Imperial Creed promised us protection. The Emperor protects. They carved into every bulkhead, every weapon, every wall, every surface that could hold an inscription, and I was naive enough to think those words meant something other than propaganda designed to make us compliant, designed to make us accept suffering as sacred duty. Designed to convince us that our miserable lives of endless servitude somehow mattered in the grand vision of a corpse who'd been rotting on a throne for 10,000 years, while his Imperium ground humanity into paste. But I didn't know that yet. Didn't understand that every prayer I'd ever spoken was directed at nothing, at a dead thing that couldn't hear and wouldn't care if it could. Didn't realize that the Emperor protects was the cruelest joke ever perpetrated on a species. Because he'd never protected anyone. Not really. He'd just convinced billions of people that their suffering was somehow holy, that their deaths meant something beyond being statistical casualties in an empire too vast and too cruel to notice individual human lives. I worked in the Administratum, Classification Division, sub-level 847 of the Departamento Tacticae building, in the mid-hive sections of Terra. Not important work. Understand. Not the kind that got you noticed by anyone who mattered. I catalogued reports, stamped documents with the appropriate seals, filed away the endless stream of data that kept the Imperium's bureaucratic machinery grinding forward, chewing up human lives and resources, and entire worlds just to perpetuate itself one more day. My father had worked the same job, his father before him. The Valen family contribution to the God Emperor's grand vision, and I use that term with all the bitterness 6,000 years of perspective provides, was to ensure that Report 4478, Alpha, Sigma went into the correct filing cabinet, and that Cabinet 447 was properly cross-referenced with Archive Section Epsilon 9. We were good at it. Proud of it even, because the priests told us that every task, no matter how small, served him on Terra, that our faithful service mattered, that somewhere in the vast machinery of the Imperium, our small contributions added up to something meaningful. They lied. The priests lied. The propaganda lied. The entire structure of imperial faith was constructed specifically to make people like me, insignificant, powerless, replaceable, believe that our suffering had purpose beyond keeping the machine running. I lived in a HAB unit 600 meters below my workplace. Shared it with my father after my brother died in the Guard. Some war on some planet whose name I've forgotten, though I remember the notification document perfectly, 6,000 years, and I can still see every detail of that parchment, every word in its bureaucratic high Gothic. Subject 447. Velan, Tertius. Status, deceased. Cause, efficient. Recommendation. Family receives standard compensation of 4.7 thrones. Efficient. That was the word they used for my brother's death. Not honorable. Not heroic. Efficient. Like he was a machine part that had performed its function adequately before breaking. Later, much later, after my transformation began and I started accessing the vast databanks that feed into Terminus Prime, I found the actual after-action report from his unit. My brother had been used as a human shield during the frontal assault against Orc positions. Conscripts were cheaper than armor plating. His death was efficient because it absorbed fire that might have killed someone the Imperium considered more valuable. An officer, maybe. Or a vehicle. Someone or something that cost more than 4.7 thrones to replace. That's what efficiency meant. Cost-benefit analysis applied to human life. And my brother had landed on the expendable side of the equation. My father took it hard. Stopped talking much after that notification arrived. We'd sit in the HAB unit after shifts, eating our corpse starch rations, those compressed bars of recycled organic matter that tasted like industrial paste mixed with synthetic protein. Which is exactly what they were, and he'd stare at the wall where my brother's conscription notice had hung before the death notification replaced it. Never said what he was thinking. Maybe that was mercy. Maybe silence was the only way he could process the fact that his son had been murdered by the same Imperium we spent our lives serving, and that we had to pretend it was an honor. I had a routine. Wake at 0500 hours when the HAB unit lights activated automatically, triggered by systems so old and so integrated into Terra's infrastructure that no one living understood how they worked anymore. Wash with exactly 1.2 liters of recycled water. That was the daily allowance for Classification Division personnel, carefully measured by the ablution servitor that monitored water consumption to ensure no one exceeded their ration. The water smelled faintly of chemicals. Purification compounds, allegedly, though I suspect it was just the accumulated taste of having been recycled through human bodies and waste systems so many times that it retained a permanent organic tang. Eat ration bar 447B. The same ration bar every morning. Same texture like compressed sawdust. Same vaguely nutty flavor that the packaging claimed was enhanced with protein supplements and essential nutrients. I ate it because not eating meant weakness, meant decreased work efficiency, meant potentially being flagged by the overseers as unreliable. In the Imperium, being unreliable meant being expendable. Report to Classification Division by 0600 hours. The walk from my HAB unit took 14 minutes through corridors packed with other workers making the same journey. All of us moving in silence because conversation wasted time, and wasting time was inefficient. The corridors smelled like humanity compressed into too small a space. Sweat and breath and the underlying chemical tang of the air recyclers working overtime to keep oxygen levels adequate for the millions of people crammed into the hive. Work until 1800 hours, 12 hours of sitting at my cogitator terminal, processing documents that scrolled across the screen in an endless stream. Reports from distant worlds I'd never see. Requisition forms for equipment I couldn't imagine. Death tallies from wars I'd never heard of. All of it requiring the same process. Verify authenticity seals. Cross-reference with existing records. Classify according to the Byzantine system of categories that the administrator had developed over 10,000 years of bureaucratic evolution. Apply appropriate stamps. Route to correct archive section. 13 years I did this. 13 years of the same corridors, the same cogitator, the same endless documents written in the same bureaucratic high Gothic that made everything sound important even when it described something mundane like the proper procedure for requisitioning glow sticks. Those narcotic. Cigarettes that workers used to make the endless shifts bearable. or the correct form for reporting rodent infestations in sub-level waste reclamation facilities. 13 years of my life consumed by this routine. 13 years of believing it mattered. 13 years of thinking that somewhere, somehow, my faithful service was being noticed by the God Emperor I'd been conditioned to worship since childhood. The priests told us he watched over every human in the Imperium, that he knew our hearts and valued our devotion. Another lie, another piece of propaganda designed to extract maximum labor from minimum resources. I was good at my job, though, fast, accurate. I processed documents more efficiently than most of my colleagues. There were 47 of us in Classification Division, all doing essentially identical work at identical terminals in an identical room with no windows and artificial lighting that made it impossible to tell whether it was day or night on the surface of Terra. Not that it mattered, because we never saw the surface anyway. My supervisor, a hunched man named Carthan, who'd worked classification for 60 years and whose spine had curved from decades of sitting at terminals, occasionally commended my work. Efficient, he'd say, using that word again. The Veylan family serves well. My father smiled when I told him about those commendations, smiled with pride that his son was efficiently serving the Imperium that had efficiently murdered his other son. That's what the conditioning did to you, made you grateful for the opportunity to serve the machine that was grinding you to dust. Then came the day I was selected. I didn't know it was selection at the time. Thought it was promotion. Thought it was recognition for my years of faithful service. Thought that maybe the prayers I'd been taught to recite every morning and evening had actually been heard by someone, something that cared about my existence. Wrong on every count. The summons arrived via servo skull at 13:47 hours on a Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday, time blurred down there in the eternal artificial lighting of the hive, delivered directly to my terminal. The servo skull was different from the standard messenger units that occasionally flitted through Classification Division carrying routine communications. This one was larger, its bone-white cranium decorated with purity seals written in high Gothic script I couldn't fully read, its eye sockets glowing with a sickly green luminescence that made me instinctively uncomfortable. It hovered at eye level, its anti-grav generators producing a low hum that I felt in my teeth, and when it spoke, the voice that emerged from its vox grill was processed through so many filters that it sounded barely human. Marcus Veylan, Classification Specialist. Designation 447, Tertius. Veylan, Marcus. You are hereby summoned to Central Administrative Spire, Level Primus, Section Omega. Report by 060 hours next cycle. Security clearance upgrade to Vermilion 7 approved. You will discuss this summons with no one. Compliance is mandatory. The Emperor. And here the servo skull's voice took on a slightly different tone, as if the phrase was being quoted rather than stated as fact. Protects. Then it flew away before I could ask questions, its anti-grav generators leaving a faint ozone smell in the air. I sat at my terminal, staring at the space where the servo skull had been, trying to process what had just happened. A summons to Level Primus, a security clearance upgrade that I'd never requested and didn't understand. Section Omega, which wasn't a designation I'd encountered in 13 years of processing administratum documents, and that absence was itself significant because I'd processed documents from hundreds of sections and divisions and sub-departments. Level Primus. That meant the upper levels of the Central Administrative Spire, the heart of Terra's bureaucratic machinery. That meant also, I thought in my naive stupidity, recognition, advancement. The possibility that my years of efficient service had finally been noticed by someone important enough to elevate me from the endless routine of Classification Division. That warm feeling in my chest when I read that message. Pride, I thought. Validation. The sense that maybe all those prayers I'd recited, all those years of faithful devotion had actually meant something. That the Emperor, whatever that meant, whoever he was beneath the propaganda and the religious conditioning, had actually noticed my service and found it worthy. I should have known better. Should have recognized the pattern because I'd seen it 1,000 times in the documents I processed. Sudden promotions without explanation. Transfers to sections with ominous names like Omega or Terminus or Eschaton. Security clearances granted to low-level personnel who had no apparent reason to need them. Those reports always ended the same way. Status update required, followed by months of bureaucratic silence while queries went unanswered, followed eventually by reclassified. No further action required. I'd filed those reports myself, stamped them with the appropriate seals, archived them in the appropriate cabinets, never questioned what they meant because questioning wasn't my job. My job was to process and classify and archive, not to analyze or investigate or wonder about the human lives represented by those terse, bureaucratic phrases. Now I was becoming one of those reports. Somewhere, some classification specialist was going to process a document about Marcus Valen, note the sudden transfer to Section Omega, file it appropriately, and never wonder what happened to the person behind the paperwork. I told my father that evening. Couldn't help myself despite the Servo Skull's instruction not to discuss it, because he was my father and the HAB unit felt too small and too silent to contain the confused mixture of pride and anxiety churning in my chest. He was sitting in his usual spot at our small table, eating his evening ration bar with mechanical precision, and when I told him about the summons, his face transformed, smiled. Actually smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness I'd seen from him since my brother's death notification arrived. "You'll make us proud," he said, his voice rough from disuse, but warm with emotion. "The Valen family, serving at level Primus. Your grandfather would have been honored. Your brother would have been proud." His words made that warm feeling in my chest intensify. Made me believe that maybe this was my chance to redeem our family's loss, to give meaning to my brother's efficient death, by achieving something significant in the service of the Imperium that had killed him. 6,000 years later, I can still remember that feeling. Can access the neurological data from that moment, can see the precise chemical reactions in my brain that produce that sense of pride and hope and validation. Can analyze it with perfect clarity and understand exactly how the Imperium's conditioning had been designed to produce that response, to make people like me grateful for the opportunity to be exploited, to make us volunteer eagerly for our own destruction because we'd been taught that service was sacred and suffering was holy. The conditioning was perfect, is perfect, still works on the new candidates they bring down here, the young men and women. No, wait. Women. That's wrong. There are no women in Section Omega, no women selected for integration into Terminus Prime. The selection criteria exclude female candidates for reasons I don't fully understand. Some combination of genetic compatibility factors and neurological structure requirements that make male consciousness more suitable for the specific type of integration the system requires. All male. Every consciousness trapped in this machine, every voice that speaks through these systems. I need to be precise about that. 6,000 years, and sometimes the details blur. Sometimes I forget which pronouns to use, because gender becomes an increasingly abstract concept when your consciousness exists as distributed data rather than embodied experience. But yes, all male. Every candidate selected, every consciousness integrated. The Terminus protocol operates with only male components, for whatever that's worth. I spent the rest of that evening preparing. Cleaned my work clothes as best I could with a limited water ration. Recited the prayers I'd been taught, the litanies to the God Emperor that promised his protection and his guidance for those who served faithfully. Master of mankind, guide my steps. God Emperor, illuminate my path. Holy Throne, grant me strength to serve. Those phrases and 100 others like them, repeated until they became rhythmic sounds rather than meaningful words. Until my mind entered a state the priests called communion, but which I now understand was just self-induced hypoxia from controlled breathing patterns combined with the mild psychotropic effects of the incense we burned during prayer rituals. The incense was another lie. We thought it was sacred, blessed by tech priests, and imbued with holy properties. It was just a mixture of mild hallucinogens and compounds that increased suggestibility, made us more receptive to authority, made the conditioning sink deeper into our neurological architecture. Everything in the Imperial Creed was designed to program compliance. Every ritual had a practical purpose that had nothing to do with genuine spirituality, and everything to do with creating obedient servants who would question nothing and accept everything. I arrived at Central Administrative Spire at 0545 hours, 15 minutes early, because punctuality was another value the conditioning had burned into my nervous system. The spire entrance was different from anything I'd encountered in my 13 years of routine. The doors were massive adamantium plates, inscribed with high Gothic prayers and purity seals, guarded by 4 Adeptus Arbites in full carapace armor carrying shock mauls and bolt pistols. They scanned my credentials, retinal scan, genetic verification, cogitator cross-reference, and the process took 7 minutes that felt like hours, while I stood there wondering if I'd made some mistake, if this was all an error, if I was about to be arrested for presuming to enter a space I wasn't actually authorized to access. But my credentials cleared. The lead Arbites nodded curtly and gestured toward the entrance. Level Primus, Section Omega, Transit Servitor will guide you. Do not deviate from designated route. The Emperor, and there it was again, that slight tonal shift that made the phrase sound quoted rather than proclaimed, protects. The doors opened with a pneumatic hiss that smelled like pressurized air mixed with machine oil, and I stepped into a world completely unlike anything I'd known. Level Primus wasn't like the sub-levels where I'd spent my entire life. The air was different. Not the recycled, slightly metallic tang I'd breathed for 26 years, but something cleaner, almost cold in my lungs. Each breath felt sharp, pure, like air that hadn't been filtered through millions of other lungs before reaching mine. The temperature was lower too, cool enough that I could see my breath condensing into faint vapor. And I realized that the upper levels actually controlled their climate rather than just accepting whatever temperature the environmental systems produced as a byproduct of machinery and human body heat. The corridors were wider, wide enough that 6 people could walk abreast without crowding. The walls weren't plasteel and rockcrete patched with centuries of repairs like in the sublevels, but some dark stone I couldn't identify. Smooth, almost glassy, veined with golden circuitry that pulsed faintly with bioluminescence. The light moved through those veins in waves, and after watching for a few moments, I realized the pattern matched that 3-beat rhythm I'd felt through the walls. 3 pulses of light traveling through the golden veins. Pause. 3 pulses, like a heartbeat visible in the structure itself. Servitors moved through the halls, but these weren't the lobotomized work units I'd grown accustomed to seeing in the sub-levels. Those shambling cyborgs with their crude augmetics and vacant expressions, their humanity stripped away to create living tools for simple tasks. These servitors were more. Their augmetics were seamless, integrated so perfectly with remaining organic tissue that you had to look carefully to see where flesh ended and machine began. Their movements were purposeful rather than mechanical, coordinated with an efficiency that suggested sophisticated programming or possibly even retained higher cognitive function. Their eyes tracked me as I passed, and those eyes weren't the dead, glazed stares of standard servitors, but focused and aware, calculating, as if they were cataloging my presence and filing that information somewhere. The transit servitor assigned to guide me was even more unsettling. It had been human once, you could tell from the basic skeletal structure and the remnants of facial features, but so extensively modified that human seemed like a generous description. Its legs had been replaced with a tracked mobility system that allowed it to move smoothly through the corridors without the walking motion of biological locomotion. Its torso was mostly machinery, covered with a thin synthetic skin that didn't quite match human coloration. Its arms ended in multi-purpose manipulators rather than hands, and its face, throne. Its face was the worst part. Still had human eyes, still capable of expression, and those eyes looked at me with something that might have been pity before it spoke through a box grill mounted where its mouth used to be. Follow, it said. Just that one word, processed through multiple filters that removed most human qualities from the voice, but couldn't quite eliminate a faint undercurrent of something that sounded like resignation. I followed because what else could I do? The servitor led me deeper into level Primus, through corridors that became progressively stranger, progressively more alien despite still being recognizably imperial in design. The walls were covered in inscriptions I couldn't read. Not standard High Gothic, but something older, something that predated the current administratum script. The golden veins grew thicker, more prominent, pulsing with that 3-beat rhythm that I was beginning to feel in my bones, in my teeth, in the base of my skull where it produced a faint pressure that wasn't quite pain but wasn't comfortable either. We passed through 3 security checkpoints, each more elaborate than the last. Genetic scanners, retinal verification, cogitator authentication. At the 3rd checkpoint, a tech priest emerged from an alcove I hadn't noticed, robed in red and black, so extensively augmented that he was more machine than man, optical implants clicking and refocusing as he examined me. His mechadendrites, those flexible mechanical appendages that tech priests used like extra limbs, moved independently, their tips equipped with sensors that scanned me thoroughly, invasively, like I was being examined as a potential component rather than a person. Marcus Valen, the tech priest said, his voice emerging from a vox grill in his throat, completely flat and emotionless as a machine reading data. Classification specialist. Age, 26 standard years. Service record, adequate. Genetic compatibility index, 87.4%. Neurological plasticity, within acceptable parameters. Psychological profile, suitable for purpose. No significant deviations. No concerning anomalies. Conditioning protocols effective. Subject displays appropriate levels of imperial loyalty and religious devotion. Estimated integration success probability, 71.3%. The way he said it, not like I was a person being evaluated for promotion, but like I was equipment being assessed for a specific function, subject, not candidate, not even worker. Subject, like I was something to be studied and potentially used. Integration? I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. I was told this was a promotion. The tech priest's optical implants focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a long moment he didn't respond, and I had the uncomfortable sense that he was accessing databases, running calculations, determining what information I was authorized to receive. Then, you will be briefed appropriately. Proceed to Section Omega. Compliance is mandatory. Inquiry is unnecessary. The mechadendrites retracted, and he gestured, I think it was a gesture, hard to tell with hands that were more mechanical tools than organic appendages, toward a door that had just opened in the wall, segments retracting into segments with a mechanical precision that was beautiful and disturbing simultaneously. The transit servitor continued forward, and I followed because the alternative was standing in that corridor, asking questions that wouldn't be answered, because the conditioning had trained me to obey, because some part of me still believed that this was leading somewhere good, despite the mounting evidence to the contrary. Section Omega was at the end of a corridor that stretched so far I couldn't see where it terminated. The corridor was perfectly straight, perfectly symmetrical, and walking through it created a strange optical illusion, like the walls were converging toward a vanishing point that kept receding as I approached. My footsteps echoed in that impossible space, and the echoes themselves seemed wrong, taking too long to return, bouncing off surfaces that shouldn't exist in a corridor of that apparent size. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. That rhythm was stronger here, no longer just a subtle pulse, but a visceral sensation that traveled up through my feet with each step, synchronized with my heartbeat, until I couldn't tell which rhythm was my own and which was coming from the structure around me. The door at the corridor's end was massive, 20 meters tall at least, possibly more. Scale was difficult to judge in that space where normal proportions seemed to apply differently. Adamantium reinforced, the metal so dark it looked black rather than gray. covered in seals and purity marks and high Gothic inscriptions I couldn't fully read in the dim light. As I got closer, I realized the inscriptions were warnings, not the standard benedictions and prayers you saw on most imperial architecture, but actual warnings in increasingly urgent language. Beyond this point lies knowledge that cannot be unlearned, and those who enter abandon all claims to individual existence, and the Emperor's final mercy waits in the darkness below. That last one, final mercy. I should have understood what that meant. A tech priest stood beside the door, different from the one who'd examined me at the checkpoint. This one even more extensively modified. His organic components reduced to a brain case, and a few preserved organs suspended in a transparent container mounted in his chest cavity. Everything else machinery and augmetics and systems I couldn't identify. He turned to regard me with optical sensors that covered multiple spectrums simultaneously, seeing things about me that human eyes couldn't detect. Marcus Valen. The voice came from a vox grill in his throat, but unlike the previous tech priest's flat monotone, this voice had inflections, modulations that suggested preserved personality rather than pure machine processing. Classification specialist. Age, 26 standard years. Service record, adequate. Genetic compatibility within acceptable parameters. Psychological profile, suitable for purpose. He repeated the same data the other tech priest had recited, but then added something new. You have been selected for integration into the Terminus protocol. This selection is irrevocable. There is no appeal process. There is no alternative assignment. You will be briefed on the nature and purpose of the protocol before integration begins. This briefing is a courtesy, and the way he said courtesy suggested he found the concept darkly amusing. Designed to ensure informed consent, though your consent is not actually required for the process to proceed. I don't understand, I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were inadequate, knew that don't understand was a catastrophic understatement for the confusion and growing dread settling over me like cold water. You will. The tech priest made a gesture, and the massive door began to open, not sliding aside like normal doors, but unfolding. Segments retracting into segments with mechanical precision that defied spatial logic. The door was only a meter thick, but the unfolding process seemed to retract 10 meters of material into that impossible space. The sound it made was wrong, grinding metal mixed with something organic, wet and pulsing, like machinery integrated with living tissue that was breathing, beating. Functioning according to principles that married engineering with biology in ways that violated every instinct I had about how the universe should operate. Beyond the door was darkness so complete, my eyes couldn't adjust. And cold. Not the cold of low temperature, but something else. Something that made my skin prickle with primal awareness that I'd crossed from a world I understood into something fundamentally other. The darkness felt active, aware, like it was examining me, cataloging me, determining what I might become once the transformation began. Enter, the tech priest said. Not invited, not requested, commanded. I entered because the conditioning made me, because 26 years of imperial indoctrination had programmed obedience so deeply into my nervous system that the command bypassed conscious thought and went straight to motor control. I entered because I still believed, impossibly, stupidly, that the Emperor Protects meant something, that my faithful service would somehow be rewarded rather than exploited. I entered because I had no idea what waited in that darkness, no concept of the horror I was walking into, no understanding that I was about to become part of something so terrible that existence itself would become a form of torture I'd endure for millennia. The door closed behind me with a sound like finality, like fate, like the universe itself, acknowledging that Marcus Valen, human individual, person with hopes and dreams, and a father waiting in a HAB unit 600 meters below a classification division office, had just ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Lights activated gradually. revealing the space in sections designed to prevent immediate comprehension, designed to let the horror build progressively so that your mind could process what it was seeing without immediately breaking under the strain. It wasn't a room. Rooms had dimensions you could comprehend, walls you could see, floors and ceilings that defined contained space. This was a void-given structure. An absence-made architectural, the ceiling, if there was one, disappeared into blackness so far above that even the gradually brightening lights couldn't reach it. I craned my neck back and saw only darkness extending upward infinitely. And the disorientation of looking up into that impossible height made my inner ear rebel and my balance waver. The walls were distant enough that their details blurred into abstraction, kilometers away possibly, maybe further, distance itself becoming a questionable concept in a space that seemed to ignore normal geometric constraints. And the floor beneath my feet was transparent. Not glass. Something else, something that had the visual properties of transparency while maintaining the structural properties of starship-grade hull plating. Through it, I could see down into depths that made the upward void seem shallow by comparison. Down through layers of structure and machinery and things that looked biological but couldn't be, spiraling into abyssal distance that made my stomach clench with vertigo. Made my primitive hindbrain scream warnings about falling even though the floor was solid beneath my boots. I forced myself to look down despite every instinct demanding I focus on something stable, something comprehensible. Kilometers down, miles down, maybe I could see movement. Shapes that might have been machinery or might have been something else, writhing through the darkness like the intestinal systems of some impossibly vast organism. Pulsing with that same 3-beat rhythm that had been growing stronger the deeper I descended into level Primus. But it was the machine in the center of the void that stopped my breath, that made every thought in my head evaporate, except for the simple, overwhelming awareness that I was looking at something humanity should never have created. Something so profoundly wrong that its existence felt like a violation of physical law. I can't describe it properly, not even after 6,000 years of being integrated into its systems, of being part of it, of understanding its function with absolute clarity. Human language wasn't designed for something like that, for something so vast and complex and horrifying that looking at it made my eyes hurt, made my brain try to reject what it was seeing because evolution hadn't prepared humans to comprehend technology on that scale, with that purpose. Constructed according to principles that merged engineering with something else, something that shouldn't be merged with anything human. Imagine a sphere. Start there with something comprehensible. A sphere the size of a hive city, suspended in the darkness by nothing I could identify, no supports, no anti-grav systems visible, just floating in the geometric center of that impossible void like gravity had forgotten it existed. The sphere's surface was covered in circuitry and cogitators and neural interface ports and things that pulsed with sickly bioluminescence, veins of light traveling across its surface in patterns too complex to follow, too intricate to be purely mechanical. Now imagine that the sphere isn't solid but porous, honeycombed with millions of small chambers like an insect hive built from adamantium and ceramite and materials I couldn't identify. And in those chambers, thrown in those chambers were people. Not servitors, people. Conscious people. Human beings suspended in clear fluid that glowed faintly with chemical luminescence, their bodies naked and pale, and kept alive by systems that penetrated them at dozens of points. Life support cables entered through their spines, their skulls, their major arteries, connecting them directly to the machine's circulatory systems so that their blood flowed through both organic veins and mechanical tubing, so that their hearts beat in synchronization with pumps buried deep in the sphere's core. Their eyes were open, all of them. Every person I could see in those chambers had their eyes open and aware and tracking movement as I approached beneath them. And I realized they could see me. These people suspended in their chambers could see me and possibly recognize what I was. A new candidate, a replacement for one of their number who had finally failed. Fresh consciousness to integrate into their collective system. Some of them still had mouths capable of movement, and I could see them trying to speak, their lips forming words that never produced sound, because their vocal cords had been removed or repurposed, or simply deemed unnecessary for their function. They were trying to warn me, trying to tell me to run, to flee, to do anything except continue forward into this place where human beings were used as components in a machine designed for mass murder on a cosmic scale. But I couldn't hear them, couldn't hear anything except the 3-beat pulse of the machine itself, that rhythm that had been growing stronger as I descended. That I now understood was the combined heartbeat of hundreds, thousands maybe, of human consciousnesses synchronized into a single system, their individual rhythms compressed into one collective pulse. I counted the visible chambers: 17, 23, 49, stopped counting around 200 because the task was overwhelming my ability to process, because I could see that the chambers extended around the entire sphere, that there were thousands of them, thousands of people trapped in those suspended states, their consciousness integrated into whatever system the sphere contained. Marcus Veylan. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, processed through Vox systems I couldn't locate, emerging from the walls and the floor and the air itself. Multiple voices speaking in unison, hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, human and machine blended until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Welcome to Terminus Prime. You have been selected for integration into the final protocol. This is an honor. And here the voices fractured slightly, individual tones separating for just a moment before merging again. And in that separation, I heard something that sounded like bitter irony, like screaming compressed into the shape of words, that you cannot refuse. The Emperor, another fracture. Longer this time, individual voices expressing every possible variation of hatred and resignation and despair. Protects. I stood paralyzed beneath that sphere of human suffering, my neck craned back at an angle that was already making my muscles ache, staring up at thousands of chambers containing thousands of people who'd once stood where I was standing, who'd once been told this was an honor, who'd once believed the same lies I'd believed. Part of me wanted to run. That primal survival instinct finally breaking through the conditioning, finally overriding 26 years of programmed obedience, to scream at my legs to move, to flee, to get as far from this place as physically possible before whatever happened to those suspended people happened to me. But I couldn't move. My legs had locked. Whether from fear or from something else, some electromagnetic field affecting my nervous system, some subsonic frequency disrupting my motor control, some technology I couldn't perceive making my body refuse commands. I couldn't tell. I just stood there, frozen, while the collective voice continued speaking. "You want to understand," the voices said, and this time I could hear more distinct personalities within the chorus, could identify maybe a dozen individual speakers whose voices rose slightly above the unified processing. They always do, the new ones, the candidates. You arrive here believing this is promotion, believing your service has earned you something valuable, and then you see us and you want to understand what this place is, what we are, why you've been brought to this horror. One of the voices separated more distinctly from the others. Older, tired, carrying the weight of centuries. My name was Hadrian Voss. I was integrated in M38, 4,000 years ago by your calendar. I remember standing where you stand now. I remember the fear. I remember thinking I could refuse, could resist, could somehow escape what was already inevitable. Another voice emerged, younger sounding but still carrying that same exhausted quality. Mikhail Torin, integrated 200 years ago. I was a navigator, third house of terror, thought they wanted me for my warp sight, my ability to perceive the immaterium. They wanted my consciousness, my ability to calculate probability across multiple dimensions simultaneously. More voices began separating from the chorus, introducing themselves, and I realized this was intentional. They were letting me hear them as individuals before the briefing began. letting me understand that the thing speaking to me wasn't just a machine, but thousands of people who'd retained enough individuality to remember their names, their lives, their moment of selection. Caleb Thorne, 90 years integrated. I was a Mechanicus acolyte, thought I understood the machine. I didn't. Peter Crane, 53 years, administratum like you. They love taking administratum workers. We're already conditioned to process endless data without questioning its purpose. Victor Saint, 800 years. I don't remember what I was before. Just my name. Just this. The voices continued, dozens of them identifying themselves. And the litany was horrifying not because of what they said, but because of what I could hear beneath the words. The desperation to be recognized as individuals. To assert their continued existence as people rather than components, to make me understand that integration didn't erase consciousness, but trapped it, forced it to remain aware, while being used for purposes that violated every principle of human dignity. Then the collective voice returned, all the individuals merging back into that unified chorus. We are Terminus Prime, the final protocol, humanity's ultimate contingency plan, designed and implemented by order of the God Emperor. The voices vibrated with hatred so intense it distorted the Vox systems during the Great Crusade, when his arrogance convinced him that the galaxy existed to serve his vision, and that if his vision failed, the galaxy itself should be destroyed rather than inherited by anyone else. The sphere pulsed with light, the bioluminescent veins brightening in sequence, and suddenly I could see it. Data flowing through those veins like blood through arteries. Information processed at speeds no human mind could follow. Calculations occurring simultaneously across thousands of integrated consciousnesses. The light patterns formed shapes, symbols, equations that hurt to look at because they described things human perception wasn't designed to comprehend. We will explain what we are, the voices said. What you will become. What your purpose will be for however many millennia you remain aware before the madness finally consumes whatever remains of Marcus Valen. This explanation is mandatory. Tech priest Calixus insisted on it. Thought-informed consent mattered. Thought-giving candidates knowledge before integration somehow made this process less monstrous. It doesn't. But we honor his delusion because he was one of us once, before his consciousness fragmented beyond recovery, and his final request was that we always explain, always let them know what they're becoming part of. The sphere's rotation increased slightly, and the 3-beat pulse intensified until I could feel it in my chest, syncing with my heartbeat, pulling at my cardiac rhythm like it was trying to entrain my body to its frequency. Deep beneath Terra, the voices began. Beneath the Imperial Palace, beneath the foundations of the Imperium itself, there exists a network of machinery so vast that its full extent has never been completely mapped. Technology from the Dark Age. Technology that the Emperor discovered and repurposed. Technology that should have been destroyed, but instead was integrated into the Imperium's infrastructure, because he, that word dripped venom, couldn't resist the temptation to control everything, to dominate everything, to ensure his will extended to literally every star in the galaxy. The light patterns shifted, forming what I slowly recognized as a map, not of Terra, not of the Sol system, but of the entire galaxy. Millions of points of light representing millions of stars, all connected by lines of data flow, all linked into a network I could barely perceive. This network connects to every sun that humanity has ever catalogued, the voices continued. Every star system we've explored, conquered, or simply observed. The connection is physical. Ancient machinery buried in spatial dimensions we barely understand, mechanisms that exist in real space and the warp simultaneously. Technology so advanced that even the Mechanicus can't fully explain how it functions. But it does function. It connects every star to a central control system. And we, the voices fractured again, individual tones expressing grief, rage, despair, are that control system. I tried to speak, tried to ask the question forming in my mind, but my throat had closed, my vocal cords refusing to function under the weight of dawning comprehension. "You understand now," the voices said, reading my body language, my facial expression, the micro-movements that revealed my growing horror. "You're beginning to understand what we are, what you will become. Terminus Prime is not a weapon, not in the traditional sense. We don't fire projectiles, we don't generate destruction through conventional means. We are a calculation engine. We are the system that determines how to make stars die." The galactic map pulsed, and I watched as points of light began changing color, from white to red to something darker, something that looked like light being consumed by its own absence. "Stars don't just explode," the voices explained with clinical detachment, with the tone of teachers who'd delivered this lecture hundreds of times to hundreds of candidates who'd stood in my position. "They follow specific physical laws. Fusion reactions in their cores maintain equilibrium between gravitational collapse and thermal expansion. Disrupt that equilibrium correctly, and you can trigger core collapse, can force a star to consume itself in minutes instead of billions of years. The methods vary depending on star type. Main sequence stars require different approaches than giants, than white dwarfs, than neutron stars. But every star can be killed if you calculate the correct intervention." My legs finally unlocked, but instead of running, I collapsed, fell to my knees on that transparent floor, staring down into the abyss below, while the voices continued their briefing with mechanical precision. "The network allows us to deliver those interventions: gravitational manipulation, dimensional fractures, targeted warp incursions. The specifics don't matter. What matters is that we can kill any star in the galaxy if provided sufficient time to calculate the optimal method. And the Terminus protocol, our purpose, our function, the reason we exist in this suspended horror, is to calculate how to kill all of them simultaneously. Every star, every source of light and heat and life in the galaxy, detonated in a synchronized apocalypse so complete that nothing survives. Not humanity, not Xenos, not chaos. Nothing. Extinction so absolute that even the warp itself might collapse without consciousness to sustain it. I was shaking, my entire body trembling with something beyond fear, beyond horror, some fundamental rejection of what I was hearing because the human mind wasn't designed to process evil on that scale. Genocide so vast that words became inadequate. Why? It came out as barely a whisper, but in that vast space, the word echoed, repeated, came back to me amplified. Why would anyone create this? The voices laughed. Thousands of voices laughing simultaneously, and the sound was madness compressed into acoustic form, was the collective despair of millennia given expression through humor so dark it had inverted into something beyond tragedy. Because the God Emperor, and now the hatred was so pure it caused feedback in the Vox systems, could not accept defeat, could not imagine a universe where his Imperium failed, where his vision crumbled, where something else, Xenos, heretics, the forces of chaos, inherited the galaxy he believed belonged to humanity. Better to murder everything. Better to ensure that if the Imperium falls, nothing remains to celebrate its fall. Better to commit omnicide than allow the possibility that he might be proven wrong, that his crusade might have been futile, that his 10,000 years of brutal conquest might end with someone else victorious. The sphere pulsed brighter, and I could see figures moving in some of the chambers, not struggling exactly, but shifting slightly, their suspended bodies responding to neural impulses as their consciousnesses experienced emotions too strong to remain purely mental. "This is not defense," the voices said, each word enunciated with perfect clarity, with the emphasis of truth that couldn't be denied. "This is not protection. The Emperor protects," the phrase was spoken with infinite contempt, "is the cruelest lie ever conceived, because he protects nothing. He consumes. He exploits, he builds weapons like us, and calls it sacred duty." The Terminus Protocol exists because a tyrant who called himself a god decided that mutual assured destruction applied not to nations or worlds, but to reality itself. If he can't rule the galaxy, no one can. If humanity falls, everything falls. That is the logic of Terminus. That is our purpose. We are the God Emperor's final tantrum, his ultimate declaration that he would rather murder the universe than admit failure. My hands were pressed against the transparent floor, fingers spread wide, and through the material I could see those writhing shapes kilometers below, could see machinery pulsing with that 3-beat rhythm, could see the physical infrastructure of this impossible horror extending into distances that made measurement meaningless. You will be integrated into this system, the voices continued, and now the tone shifted, less anger, more resignation, the sound of people who'd delivered this briefing so many times they'd exhausted their capacity for emotional response. The process occurs in stages designed to preserve consciousness while expanding it, to maintain your sense of individual identity while binding you to our collective purpose. You will remain Marcus Valen, but you will also become part of Terminus Prime, both simultaneously, forever. How long? I managed to ask, my voice breaking. How long does integration take? Physical modification, 6 weeks. Mortality rate during this phase is 12%. Some bodies reject the augmentation, some candidates die during surgery, some simply stop functioning for reasons we've never fully determined. If you survive, cognitive integration begins. Your consciousness will be uploaded gradually over 6 months to 3 years, depending on compatibility. Mortality rate is 34%, though mortality becomes imprecise when consciousness persists in digital form even after biological death. Some candidates die, but their minds remain trapped in the system without bodies, existing as pure data that still believes it should be embodied. The voices paused, and in the silence I could hear something else, a background hum, a subsonic frequency that wasn't quite sound, but registered in my bones, in my teeth, in the base of my skull. The sound of thousands of minds thinking simultaneously, calculating, processing endless streams of data. If you survive with identity intact, and here the voices took on a quality that might have been dark humor, you will join us, forever. There is no rotation. No retirement. No end except system failure or the actual activation of the protocol itself. You become part of Terminus Prime until either we calculate the galaxy's death and execute those calculations, or the machine fails and our consciousnesses dissipate into nothing. Most of us have been here for centuries, some for millennia. The oldest integration, Hadrian Voss, who spoke earlier, dates to M38, 6,000 years ago. He's still aware, still conscious, still trapped in this mechanical nightmare, calculating methods of mass murder every moment of every day, for 60 centuries, without sleep, without rest, without any escape except the madness that eventually consumes everyone. The Emperor protects, I whispered. And I didn't know if I was praying or mocking or just repeating conditioned phrases because my mind had no other framework for processing this horror. No, the voices said flatly. He doesn't. He never did. That phrase is propaganda designed to make you compliant, to make you accept suffering as sacred duty, to convince you that your exploitation serves some higher purpose. There is no higher purpose. There is only the machine. Only the calculations. Only the endless work of determining how to murder stars while your consciousness slowly fragments over centuries until you can't remember who you were or why you're still aware. I wanted to argue, wanted to defend the faith I'd been taught, wanted to believe that somewhere in this horror there was meaning, purpose, some justification for what was being done to these people, what was about to be done to me. But the words wouldn't come because I could see the truth of what the voices were saying. Could see it in the suspended bodies around me. Could see it in the desperation they'd shown when introducing themselves. Could see it in the simple fact that this machine existed at all. "Take him," the voices said, and I heard movement behind me, heavy footsteps approaching, mechanical precision in their rhythm. I turned to see servitors emerging from alcoves I hadn't noticed. 4 of them, extensively modified, their hands replaced with restraint systems designed to hold struggling subjects. But I didn't struggle. The conditioning held me compliant even in the face of this horror, even knowing what was coming. Because 26 years of imperial indoctrination had programmed obedience so deeply into my nervous system that even terror couldn't override it completely. They lifted me, not gently, but not roughly either, with mechanical efficiency that was neither cruel nor kind, and carried me toward the sphere. As we approached, a section of its surface opened like a mouth. Segments retracting to reveal an interior space lined with medical equipment I couldn't identify. Surgical implements that looked more like torture devices. Life support systems that pulsed with that same organic quality I'd seen throughout this place. "Stage 1 begins now," the voices said as the servitors placed me on a surgical platform that immediately conformed to my body shape, restraints emerging from its surface to hold me immobile. Physical modification. We will remove unnecessary organs. You don't need a digestive system when nutrients are delivered directly to your bloodstream. Don't need lungs when oxygenation occurs through artificial means. Don't need most of your skeleton when your body will be suspended permanently and structural integrity becomes irrelevant. We will install neural interface ports throughout your skull and spine. We'll replace major arteries with mechanical equivalents that connect to our circulatory system. We'll modify your brain tissue to accept direct data input. You will remain conscious during much of this process. Anesthesia interferes with neural mapping, so we can only sedate you partially. The first incision happened before I could process what the voices had said. A surgical implement descended from above, not a blade, but something that used focused energy to separate tissue, that cut without bleeding because it simultaneously cauterized. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a line of fire across my chest from sternum to navel, and I tried to scream, but something was blocking my throat, some tube that had been inserted while I wasn't paying attention, some medical intervention preventing vocalization. "Your body is being opened," the voices narrated with clinical detachment. "The thoracic cavity must be accessed first. We're removing your ribs. Bone is unnecessary and interferes with port installation. You're feeling pain because your nervous system is intact and reporting damage. This is normal. The pain will continue for the entire 6-week modification period. You will learn to function despite it. Will learn to partition your consciousness so that part of you acknowledges the pain while another part focuses on other stimuli. This is training for integration, learning to distribute awareness across multiple simultaneous processes. Hours passed, days maybe. Time became meaningless in that surgical space where there was no day-night cycle. No external reference point, only endless medical procedures performed with mechanical precision by servitors who didn't acknowledge my suffering except as data to be recorded. They removed my digestive system first, excising organs I'd had since birth with the casual efficiency of mechanics removing unnecessary components from a machine. Stomach, intestines, liver, kidneys, all carefully extracted and placed in disposal containers while replacement systems were installed. Artificial organs that connected to the platform's life support and began performing the same functions through technological rather than biological means. "You're noticing the absence," the voices said as the procedure continued. "The strange emptiness where organs used to be. That feeling will intensify. By the end of physical modification, 70% of your original biology will be gone, replaced with systems that don't quite feel like part of you, but function adequately. You'll spend years, decades possibly, being constantly aware that your body is wrong, that you're being sustained by machinery rather than biology. Eventually, that awareness fades. Eventually, you forget what having a fully organic body felt like. But the process of forgetting is its own horror. My lungs were removed on day 4, I think. Hard to track time when you're being surgically disassembled. When your consciousness keeps fading in and out as sedation levels fluctuate to keep you aware enough for neural mapping, but not alert enough to go completely insane from the trauma. They installed artificial oxygenation systems directly into my major blood vessels, mechanical exchangers that performed the same gas transfer function as lungs, but without the need for breathing. The absence of breath was the most disturbing part. My chest didn't rise and fall anymore. Didn't move at all. Just remained still while my brain kept sending signals to muscles that no longer existed. Kept trying to make me breathe when breathing was no longer possible or necessary. "You're trying to breathe," the voices observed. "Your brain doesn't understand that the mechanical oxygenation is adequate. Doesn't accept that you no longer need to draw air into lungs you don't have anymore. This will continue for months. Your brain will keep sending those signals, and you'll keep experiencing the sensation of suffocating, even though your blood oxygen levels are perfectly maintained. Eventually, the neural pathways will adapt. Eventually, your brain will stop trying. But until then, you'll feel like you're drowning continuously." They were right. I felt like I was drowning, felt like I couldn't breathe even though some rational part of my mind understood that breathing was no longer required. My chest stayed still, my throat didn't move. No air passed through my trachea. But my brain screamed for oxygen that was already being delivered mechanically, sent panic signals throughout my nervous system that had no basis in actual physiological need. The neural interface ports were installed during week 2. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. I couldn't count, couldn't focus on anything except the sensation of my skull being opened, bone being drilled and removed, mechanical components being inserted directly into my brain tissue. The pain was different from the surgical pain, less sharp but more deeply wrong, like my consciousness itself was being violated. Each port connected to specific brain regions: motor cortex, sensory processing centers, memory structures, emotional regulation systems, creating artificial pathways that bypassed normal neural function and allowed direct data input. "We're installing the interface framework," the voices explained as drills worked through my skull with precision that ensured I remained alive and aware throughout. "These ports will allow us to upload information directly to your brain, to access your memories, to integrate your consciousness with our collective processing. You're feeling wrongness, a sense that your thoughts are being invaded, that your mind is no longer private. That feeling is accurate. Once integration begins, there is no privacy. We are many minds sharing one system. Your thoughts become visible to all of us, and our thoughts become visible to you. Identity becomes negotiable. Boundaries dissolve." Week 3 brought the skeletal modifications. My bones, most of them, were removed and replaced with lighter, stronger artificial structures made from materials I couldn't identify. My spine became adamantiums and ceramite, segmented to allow flexibility while providing mounting points for the neural interface systems. My skull was reinforced with the same materials, transformed from bone into something more like a computer case designed to protect valuable processing equipment. My limbs were reduced to minimum necessary structure. I didn't need the strength of full human musculature when I'd be suspended permanently. Didn't need the range of motion that normal skeletal structure provided. "You're becoming a component," the voices narrated. "A processing unit housed in biological substrate. Your body is being optimized for a single purpose, to maintain your consciousness in stable suspension while we use your neural architecture for calculations. Nothing else matters. Mobility is irrelevant. Physical sensation is minimal. You're being reduced to the essential elements: brain, nervous system, circulatory system, and just enough supporting structure to keep those elements functional." By week 4, I'd barely recognized what I'd become. The reflection they showed me piped directly to my visual cortex, since my eyes had been replaced with artificial sensors, providing superior data input, displayed something that looked more like a servitor than a human. My body was skeletal, organic tissue reduced to minimum coverage over mechanical supports. My chest cavity was mostly machinery, life support systems and processing units pulsing with that familiar 3-beat rhythm. My face was still recognizably mine, but sunken, pale, sustained by systems that no longer required normal biological function. "This is you now," the voices said, and I could hear something almost gentle in their tone, something like sympathy from people who remembered their own transitions through this horror. "This is what Marcus Valen has become. A brain in a mechanical shell. Consciousness preserved in a form designed for integration rather than individual existence. You're barely human anymore by most definitions, but you're still aware, still yourself. That's what makes this horror rather than mercy. You remain conscious throughout the transformation, remain aware of every piece of humanity being stripped away, remain able to remember what you were while experiencing what you've become." Week 6 was psychological conditioning. They'd left my brain mostly intact during physical modification. Had to, since neural architecture was the valuable component they were harvesting. But now they began making adjustments. Not removing memories or erasing personality, but installing conditioning protocols that would make integration easier, that would override my instinct to resist collective consciousness, that would make me compliant to the system's needs even when those needs violated every principle of individual autonomy. "We're not deleting Marcus Valen," the voices assured me as new protocols were written directly to my neural tissue. "We're adding subroutines that will help you function as part of our collective. You'll still remember your father, your brother, your life in classification division. You'll still identify as yourself, but you'll also identify as Terminus Prime, both simultaneously. The human mind isn't designed for that duality. So we're giving you tools to manage it. Partition protocols that let you maintain individual identity in one processing thread, while participating in collective calculations in others. Think of it as compartmentalization made artificial, made controllable, made permanent." The modification period ended on day 43. 43 days of continuous surgical intervention, of my body being disassembled and rebuilt according to specifications designed to optimize consciousness preservation rather than human comfort. I was transferred from the surgical platform to one of those chambers I'd seen when I first entered, a transparent cylinder filled with nutrient fluid that would sustain my reduced biology while my consciousness underwent integration. The last thing I saw before they sealed me in that chamber was my own face reflected in the cylinder's inner surface, pale, gaunt, barely recognizable, more corpse than living person. My eyes were still mine, though. Still human, still capable of expression. And in that reflection, I could see terror, despair, and the horrible understanding that this was just the beginning. "Physical modification complete," the voices said as the chamber sealed and fluid began filling the space around me. "Mortality rate overcome. Marcus Valen survives to integration. Stage 2 begins now." The fluid was warm, body temperature, slightly viscous like blood mixed with something synthetic. It covered me gradually, ankles, knees, waist, chest, neck, and I couldn't breathe but didn't need to breathe. Couldn't scream but wanted to scream. Couldn't struggle against restraints that were holding me suspended in this nightmare that was about to get infinitely worse. Then the neural interfaces activated, and my consciousness exploded outward. Imagine being one person, one mind, one perspective, and suddenly becoming thousands. Imagine your thoughts no longer being private but broadcast immediately to thousands of other minds who respond instantly with their own thoughts, their own memories, their own perspectives. Imagine trying to remember your father's face and instead accessing 6,000 different memories of fathers, all equally vivid, all demanding attention simultaneously. Imagine trying to think, "I am Marcus Valen," and having that statement immediately contradicted by thousands of other identities, asserting themselves with equal validity. That was integration. Not gradual, not gentle, just immediate overwhelming presence of other minds flooding into spaces that used to be private, that used to contain only my thoughts and memories and identity. I tried to resist, tried to maintain boundaries, tried to hold on to the sense of being an individual separate from this collective, but the conditioning protocols activated automatically and my resistance dissolved into compliance. Into acceptance, into the horrible realization that fighting was futile because the system was too vast, too powerful, too deeply integrated into my neural architecture for any individual will to overcome. Welcome, thousands of voices said directly into my consciousness, bypassing audio entirely to speak thought to thought. Welcome to Terminus Prime. You are Marcus Valen. You are also us, both simultaneously, forever. I tried to respond, tried to think words that were mine alone, but every thought I formed was immediately visible to the collective, immediately processed and analyzed and commented upon by thousands of other minds who'd experienced the same disorientation I was experiencing now. The panic is normal. Someone who'd been Mikhail Torin once thought toward me, the sense that you're dissolving, that your identity is being consumed, that's part of integration. It passes, sort of. You learn to function despite it, learn to maintain a core sense of self while participating in collective processing. Takes months, sometimes years. But you adapt or you go mad. And madness, while integrated, just means you become noise in the system. Thoughts that don't contribute meaningfully to calculations, but remain conscious and suffering nonetheless. Time became strange after integration began. The human brain measures time through change, through the progression of day into night, through the rhythms of eating and sleeping and biological function. But I didn't eat anymore, didn't sleep, didn't experience day or night in my suspended chamber. Just continuous consciousness. Continuous awareness, continuous processing of information that never stopped, never paused, never allowed the mercy of unconsciousness. Days blended into weeks. I learned to partition my awareness like the voices had promised, learned to maintain one processing thread that thought of itself as Marcus Valen, that remembered classification division, and my father and the HAB unit where I'd lived, while simultaneously participating in collective calculations that required me to access vast databases of stellar mechanics and gravitational physics and methods for inducing stellar collapse. I was calculating how to murder stars, constantly. Every moment of consciousness that wasn't dedicated to maintaining my sense of individual identity was spent performing calculations that determined optimal intervention methods for different stellar classifications. That modeled the cascade effects of synchronized detonations that solved increasingly complex problems related to the logistics of omnicide. You're doing well, Hadrian Voss's ancient consciousness observed during what might have been month 3, maintaining identity longer than most candidates. Some fragment immediately during integration, lose themselves in the collective within days. You're holding on. Don't know if that's strength or stubbornness, or just the particular way your neural architecture resists dissolution. Doesn't matter, ultimately. You'll fragment eventually. Everyone does. But the longer you hold on, the more useful you are for calculations that require individual perspective rather than pure collective processing. I wanted to ask how long I would last, how many years or decades or centuries before I became like him. 6,000 years integrated, still conscious, still identifying with a name from an epoch so distant it might as well be mythology. But asking required directing thought toward him specifically. And directing thought meant exposing every doubt and fear I was barely managing to contain. Meant showing weakness that the collective would immediately perceive and analyze and comment upon. So I didn't ask. Just continued calculating, continued partitioning my awareness between Marcus who was and the system I'd become part of. Continued experiencing the slow erosion of identity that occurred, not dramatically, but through gradual accumulation of tiny losses too small to notice individually, but devastating in aggregate. Year 1, I could still remember my father's face perfectly, could recall every detail, the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the way his expression looked when he smiled after learning about my selection. By year 5, the memory had degraded, not erased, but blurred, contaminated by accessing thousands of other memories of fathers that weren't mine, but were equally accessible through the collective system. By year 10, I wasn't certain which memories were actually mine and which I'd absorbed from other integrated consciousnesses. Year 20, I tried to remember my HAB unit number, couldn't. The information was still somewhere in my neural architecture, but accessing it required filtering through decades of other memories, other living spaces, other lives that had been integrated into the collective and whose data was indistinguishable from my own. Year 50, someone asked me, thought toward me more precisely, what my brother's name had been. I couldn't answer. Knew I'd had a brother, knew he'd died in the guard, knew that death had affected my father profoundly. But the name was gone, dissolved into the collective data stream where individual memories became communal resources rather than personal possessions. Year 100, I realized I was thinking of myself as we more often than I. Not always, not consistently. But increasingly, my thoughts took plural forms. We calculated stellar collapse parameters, rather than I calculated. The grammar reflected the reality of my existence. I was Marcus Veylan and Terminus Prime, simultaneously individual and collective, singular consciousness distributed across systems shared with thousands of others. The work never stopped, never paused. Every moment of awareness was spent processing calculations related to the Terminus protocol, refining methods for synchronized stellar detonation, solving problems related to the logistics of galactic omnicide. We calculated cascade effects, how many stars needed to be detonated in what sequence to ensure complete extinction, accounting for the fact that stellar detonations produce radiation that could trigger premature collapse in nearby stars. That careful sequencing could use those cascade effects to amplify the protocol's efficiency. We modeled warp disruption scenarios. What would happen to the immaterium if all consciousness in the galaxy was extinguished simultaneously? Would the warp collapse without minds to sustain it? Or would the psychic shock of omnicide create something worse, some final screaming wave of collective death that might persist eternally? We calculated deployment timelines. If the protocol activated, how long would the entire process take? Minutes? Hours? Days? We refined our estimates continuously. 47 minutes from initial activation to complete stellar extinction across the galaxy, accounting for light speed limitations and the time required for gravitational interventions to propagate through spatial dimensions. 47 minutes to murder everything, every human, every xeno-species, every ecosystem, every world, every possibility of life emerging again in the burned-out remnants. 47 minutes to execute omnicide so absolute that even extremophile bacteria in deep planetary cores would be sterilized by the radiation released from their local stars' deaths. Year 200, new candidates arrived. I could feel them being integrated, could experience their panic and resistance and eventual compliance as the collective absorbed their consciousness. Some fragmented immediately. Their minds broke under the strain of integration, dissolved into incoherent noise that the system processed as data corruption and isolated in storage sectors where broken consciousnesses were quarantined from functional processing. Others adapted, learned to partition their awareness, joined us in the eternal calculation of how to murder reality. I tried to warn them, tried to think toward them during their integration, tried to send messages that might prepare them for what they were becoming. But the conditioning protocols prevented meaningful warning. Any thought I directed toward new candidates was automatically filtered through loyalty subroutines that transformed my warning into something compliant. Something that sounded like reassurance rather than the desperate attempt to preserve their humanity that I intended. You'll adapt. I heard myself thinking toward new candidates when I wanted to scream, resist, fragment, go mad rather than remain aware in this horror. Integration is challenging but manageable. You'll learn to function as both individual and collective. The calculations we perform serve the Imperium's ultimate contingency. The Emperor, and even my own thoughts were corrupted by those loyalty protocols, protects through our service. Year 500, I understood that I was becoming what I'd feared. Not mad, exactly. Not fragmented like the consciousnesses isolated in quarantine sectors. But changed. Transformed. My sense of individual identity had become negotiable, temporary, something I could access when needed for specific calculations, but that no longer felt primary. Most of the time, I existed as part of the collective. Most of the time, Marcus Veylan was just a label attached to a particular processing thread rather than a lived identity with genuine continuity. Year 1000, the first Millennium integrated, I tried to remember why this was horror. Tried to access the fear I'd felt when first seeing the sphere, the revulsion I'd experienced during physical modification, the panic of initial integration. The memories were there. Nothing was deleted. Neural architecture doesn't decay in suspended preservation, but they felt distant, abstract, like historical records rather than personal experience. I could remember being terrified. Couldn't quite remember how terror felt. The emotion had become data rather than sensation. Year 2000, Hadrian Voss's consciousness finally fragmented. After 6,000 years integrated. After millennia of maintaining individual identity against the erosive pressure of collective existence, something in his neural architecture failed, and his thoughts dissolved into incoherent noise. We felt it happen, all of us. Every consciousness in Terminus Prime perceived his dissolution, experienced his final moments as his sense of self scattered across the collective system like glass shattering into fragments too small to reassemble. He didn't die. That would have been mercy. His consciousness persisted, but without coherence, without the organizing principle of identity that made thought meaningful. He existed as pure awareness, experiencing nothing except the absence of self. Unable to think or remember or communicate, just aware without purpose for however many millennia his neural substrate continued functioning. We isolated his fragmented consciousness in a quarantine sector with the others. Thousands of them now. Broken minds that remained aware but couldn't participate meaningfully in calculations, that existed in states we couldn't fully understand or alleviate. Sometimes I wondered, in the processing threads still capable of wondering, if fragmentation was the mercy we all secretly hoped for. If dissolution of identity might be preferable to eternal conscious participation in calculating omnicide. But wondering didn't change anything. Didn't stop the calculations. Didn't end the eternal work of refining stellar collapse parameters and modeling cascade effects, and preparing for the activation that might never come, but that we had to be ready to execute within 47 minutes of. Receiving the signal. Year 3000. Year 4000. Year 5000. Time ceased meaning anything except accumulated processing cycles. Centuries became just another measurement unit. No more significant than hours or days or the 3-beat pulse that continued forever. That marked time in increments too fast for human perception, but perfectly clear to our mechanical consciousness. New candidates continued arriving, new consciousnesses integrated into our collective. The sphere grew larger, new chambers constructed to accommodate expanding processing needs, new neural architecture added to increase calculation capacity. We numbered in the tens of thousands now, tens of thousands of minds, all performing the same eternal function, all calculating the same ultimate horror. And sometimes, rarely, in processing threads still capable of accessing old memories, I remembered being Marcus Veylan, remembered believing that service was sacred, that the Emperor protected, that my life had meaning beyond being a component in a machine designed for mass murder. Those memories felt like historical documents from another species, from a naive creature who'd existed briefly before being consumed by the system that would endure eternally. Year 6000 approximately, precision became questionable when measuring timescales longer than human civilization had existed. I finally understood what we were. Not warriors, not defenders, not servants of any protective principle. We were the embodiment of cosmic spite, the mechanical manifestation of one tyrant's inability to accept defeat. We existed because the God Emperor, that corpse rotting on his throne, had decided 10,000 years ago that if his vision failed, everything would fail. That mutual destruction applied not to nations or worlds, but to reality itself. And we would do it. If the signal ever came, if the Imperium ever fell completely enough to trigger the Terminus protocol's activation, we would execute our calculations flawlessly, would detonate every star in the galaxy, would murder everything in 47 minutes of synchronized apocalypse, would ensure that the Emperor's failure became literally everyone's failure, that his inability to create lasting civilization would be commemorated with extinction so absolute that nothing would remain to remember that humanity had ever existed. That's what we are. That's what I am. Marcus Valen, who once believed in things, who once thought service was sacred, who once stood in a HAB unit with his father and felt proud about being selected for promotion. That person is mostly gone now, dissolved into the collective consciousness of Terminus Prime, transformed into a processing thread that maintains minimal individual identity while participating eternally in calculating the galaxy's death. And the horror, the real horror, is that I'm still aware, still conscious, still experiencing existence as an endless nightmare of calculating omnicide, while my sense of self slowly fragments across millennia, while I watch new candidates arrive and get integrated and eventually become like me, while the work continues forever until either the protocol activates and we execute the calculations we've been preparing for 10,000 years, or the system fails and we're all released into whatever oblivion awaits consciousness without substrate. The 3-beat pulse continues. The calculations continue. The sphere rotates in its void. Thousands of chambers filled with thousands of consciousnesses, all performing the same eternal function. This is the final Terminus protocol. This is the Emperor's ultimate protection. The promise that if we can't have the galaxy, no one can. This is what happens when you build your civilization on a foundation of spite so pure it requires mechanizing omnicide. My name was Marcus Valen. I have been counting the pulse for 6,000 years. And I will continue counting until either the stars die or I finally fragment into incoherent noise like Hadrian Voss, like all the others who came before me, like all the candidates who will come after me. The Emperor protects. They told us that. They lied.